All right, friends, we are going to be working on our Jen Aranyi inspired landscape drawings. And what you're going to need for this is your paper. You're going to need thick watercolor paper or thicker mixed media paper, maybe a thick heavy drawing paper that you can get wet, poster board, tag board, anything that's heavy. You really want thick paper. Really thin paper like copy paper or printer paper really is not going to work well for this. You're also going to need a pencil and a Sharpie and some things for your watercolor part. You might end up using watercolor paints, or we might end up using markers, washable markers, along with some brush and water combo. I'll be showing you that later. But the other thing you might want to have on hand is a pair of scissors and maybe a straight edge, because you're not going to be limited by the size paper that you have. So we have this nice big rectangular paper, but one thing that Jen Aranyi likes to do a lot is work really small and sometimes larger, and she also likes to use a lot of interesting shapes. Some of her paintings are round and circular, some are triangle shaped, some are shapes that she makes up that are just kind of fun, funky, weird shapes, and some are even recognizable shapes like bottles and things like that. So I'm actually going to divide this paper up into a few different little scenes, a few different shapes, so that I have some variety, some different things to choose from. I have a nice triangle stencil here. If you don't have a triangle stencil like I do, you can always find a straight edge or a ruler. I'm just using the edge of this giant eraser of mine, and you can draw shapes using whatever you have. So I could do a triangle this way, or I could come up with some funky, funny shape that maybe is not exactly a triangle, but is some other goofy shape. So I'm actually going to do, I'm going to have my line come up this way, and then I think I'm going to connect them at a fun angle. So this is going to be kind of like a funky shape that I made up using my straight edge. I'm also going to do a couple other ones so you can see some variety, some different options, but you get to decide what sort of shape you're going to create for your little landscape. You might use the whole paper, or you might want to use half of it. If you want to do something that's more of a circular, you could find a circle shaped object to use as a template. If it's a tape, for example, you could use the inside if you want it to be small. Oops. Or you could use the outside even, so you get a nice large shape. So these are something I'm going to end up cutting out later. I'm actually not going to cut them out now because I like the idea of being able to have this outside edge to paint outside of if I make a mistake or something. And what we're going to work on right now is drawing our landscapes. So let's zoom in so we can check that out. Okay, let's start with this sort of triangle shape. And what I'm going to do inside of my little landscape is I'm going to create a scene that is going to be just black and white, but I want to make sure I leave plenty of room for the sky, because the sky is where it's going to be colorful and beautiful. So I'm going to do some mountains. So I'm going to start by going up and then down. They don't have to be perfect. There we go. And right where these little peaks are is where I'm going to have that line extend. And I think I'm going to have like a little kind of road going back into the distance. It's going to start big and be skinnier as it goes back. And I think I'm going to have some trees here. So I'm going to just start with a straight line. And I'm not going to worry about them being too perfect right now, because I'm going to be going over them with Sharpie, and that's going to make them look a little bit nicer. And the further away they are, the smaller they're going to get. So I'm going to have some really tiny ones back here, maybe even some like bushes and stuff. Okay, so this is just the beginning of it. Now what I'm going to do is, coming from the peak here, I'm going to do kind of this funny wavy line coming straight down and then going across back. I'm going to do that again here and have it connect to that line that came down. And in this space is where I'm going to be doing some texture, some lines. We're going to give this the illusion that it's a shadow. It doesn't look really like it is now, but it will in just a moment. So what I'm going to be doing is drawing some texture lines here and adding a few other textures. So let's move on to the Sharpie step. I just did the pencil just to give myself a nice outline, and now I'm going to start going over everything with Sharpie. So let's go through here. And the reason why we're using Sharpie is because Sharpie will not erase or smudge when it gets wet. So that's why I want to do this, because I am going to be adding some water to this to create some paint. Now before I do all my trees, let's get some textures in here. So on the sides where I created these funny little like openings, I'm going to take my Sharpie and just draw a bunch of straight lines, kind of close together inside each section. I'm going to do that all the way across for all of the ones that I did. And that's just going to give us this illusion that we have sort of a shadow on the side of the mountains. Inside here, I'm going to do a few little cracks and kind of crevices to create more texture. So it's just kind of a random shape, not worrying if the shape is perfect or if it makes any sense. I'm going to do some more little lines inside of those little shapes too. Okay. And for the trees, I'm going to really kind of fill it with a lot of lines and textures to really give it this illusion that these are these sort of silhouettes of trees. So I'm going to do some dashes and lines. And I'm making sure there's a lot of little textures peeking out, because I really want this to feel like a fluffy, full tree silhouette. All right, and I'm going to keep doing this until I finish all my little trees, so I'm going to zoom ahead a little bit here. Okay, so you can see what I did here is I added a little horizon line. That's sort of where the ground and the sky meet. So I kind of did that all the way across, right about where the road was going to end, just to give it some differentiation between the ground and the sky. And I added a few more little textures here. So this is scene 1 done. I'm going to move over and do another scene, just so you can see some variety of some maybe different options. They don't always have to be mountains with little trees in there. You could have houses or vehicles, or you could have just silhouettes of trees. There's lots of different options. So I'm just going to do a couple so you can see a little bit of variety, but I'm going to speed right through it. Okay, here we go. All 4 of my little mini landscapes completed and finished. So there's 4 different types of scenes that you could choose from. I mean, you could do anything even beyond what I just did, but looking here, we have a mountain scene with some ground and some trees and a little pathway. Maybe this is a river. You could do some textures inside of it, make it a river instead. You could add a little camper or a little deer, like silhouette of a deer or something. That would be really cute. This one's just mountains, this one's just trees, and this one's trees and mountains together. So I kind of tried to show you a few different outline shapes, a few different scenes, and now we're ready to put our color in. This is the sort of the fun magical part. So there's two different ways to add your watercolor. One is to actually use a watercolor palette, so use actual watercolor paints. The other technique is to find yourself some sort of palette, whether it's a piece of foil or a plastic baggie or something like that, and make sure you have some markers on hand. The only kind of markers that won't work for this are Sharpie markers, because as I said earlier, Sharpie does not bleed or do anything when you get it wet. So you want to make sure you have markers that are not permanent so that they will mix and bleed so we can turn them into watercolor paint. So I'll show you with watercolor paint first, and then I'll show you with the markers. So you should have your cup of water, your brush, and your paints, and of course your finished work here. Now, in order to start painting, we're going to start by activating our paints. So I'm going to take my brush and just sort of dip it a couple times into whatever colors I think I might end up using. That way the paint can start softening up from the water, and this just sort of gets it ready to go. So I'm not sitting here stirring and mixing, I'm just dripping some water droplets into each color that I think I want to use. That way it can sit and sort of soak up that water and make that paint much more liquidy and saturated, much brighter. Okay, so we got our watercolors all sort of saturated and ready to go, and we're ready to paint our sky. Now we are not painting the landscape. We're not painting the mountains, the trees. If you did a road or a pathway or anything, we're not doing any of that. That's going to stay black and white. The only thing that's going to get colored is dye. And what I like to do first to sort of make sure that my watercolor spreads nicely is I like to take some of the wet water, and I like to sort of paint the paper with just water first. And this is just going to sort of help prepare the surface to allow the paints to bleed and spread a little bit easier together. This is not a technique you absolutely have to do. I'll show you on the next one what it looks like when you do not paint the surface, but I just wanted to kind of paint the surface to get the paper wet and ready to go. And I'm going to take my brush and dip it into some of my colors, and I'm just going to lay it down on the paper here. And because there's water already on the paper, you can see how it's sort of very soft and lightly bleeding into another color. I'm going to put a different color here. One of the characteristics of her work is that she has kind of layers of color. One color kind of bleeds into another color. So that's sort of what I'm trying to do. And the only thing you have to do is be really careful when you get near the mountain range or the trees or whatever it might be, because you want to kind of leave the things that are supposed to be white. And so I'm trying really hard not to paint on it. If you get a little bit on there, it's not the end of the world. Just try your best to be as careful as you can. All right, there's the first one done. Just by using the watercolors, I was able to bleed one into the other. Let's still use the watercolors, but this time let's go over here and not wet the paper first, so we can kind of see how that looks. I think I'm going to start with sort of a deeper green at the top. So you can see when you paint with it, the edge stays a little bit straighter and stiffer. It doesn't bleed out as much as it did in this one, which may or may not be an effect that you would like. Kind of have to decide for yourself. And there's my second one, this time without wetting the surface first. And I just did the same thing. I did paint over the trees completely, and that is because they're just black. There is no white, so there was nothing I needed to worry about leaving white. Now, if you have mountains or thing, you are going to need to be a little bit more careful because you don't want to paint it. You can see I got a little bit on the tip of the mountain there. It's okay, it still looks good. Now let's move on to painting some of the other ones up above with marker watercolor instead of actual watercolor. So let's get to that. Okay, in order to use marker as watercolor, you're going to need a piece of foil or maybe a plastic bag, something that you can rub the marker onto the surface of. You're also still going to need your water and brush, and then of course markers. Again, just make sure they're not permanent markers. I think for this one I'm going to do sort of a sunset type of theme. So I'm going to take one marker and color in this section. You can see how the marker ink is pooling together and it's not staying together, and that's okay because that's what you want to have happen. You want to make sure that it is sitting on the surface so that you can turn it into paint. Whatever colors you're laying down, make sure you give them a little space though, so that you don't have them right on top of each other. You do want a little bit of a gap so that they don't mix on your palette. And then when you're ready, you're going to add your water, and you can see how quite easily this turns into a very nice paint. So I'm going to take this and just apply it directly to my paper. And without having any actual watercolors, we can use our markers to create this beautiful watercolor effect, the same way we would with watercolor. You can see a beautiful sunset effect using my marker watercolors rather than actual real watercolors. If you ever think it's not quite dark enough, you can always just add a little bit more ink and not add any more water. Just keep the water you might have, but add more pigment to it. That will thicken the paint and make it a little bit darker. One thing you need to keep in mind is that watercolor using markers does tend to dry a little quicker. So sometimes you can see the marks that you've left a little bit easier, but you just have to work a little quickly. That's all right. And let's just do this last one so we're all finished, and then we'll discuss our results. Have all 4 of my little mini Jen Aranyi inspired landscape paintings all finished. Again, I painted while they were all still on the same paper, and that allowed me to be able to make a few mistakes. I was able to go outside the lines a little bit without worrying too much, because I'm going to just be cutting these out when they're dry, and that way it just keeps the paper from buckling too much too. Buckling means that it starts bubbling up and warping. When something gets wet, it tends to swell and kind of raise up, and then as it dries, it flattens back out. So having it on the large sheet really helps these dry a lot flatter than if I had them out as individual pieces. They would tend to curl up a lot and really warp the paper. So I hope you guys had fun doing this. When they are dry and completed, that is when you're going to get your handy dandy scissors and cut them all out, and then you will have a bunch of beautiful mini landscapes that you can admire and hang.